The incense hung heavy in the air of St. Patrick's Cathedral, a thick, silver fog that smelled of ancient prayers, expensive beeswax, and the damp wool of 1,000 overcoats. Outside New York City was a gray smudge of sleet and yellow taxis, but inside the cavernous sanctuary, the world felt suspended in a different century altogether. It was 1974, a year of cynicism and shifting tides. Yet here, under the soaring Gothic arches, the old world still held its breath. In the front pew, sitting with a stillness that contradicted his reputation as the world's most relaxed man, was Dean Martin. He wore a charcoal gray suit tailored with such precision, it looked like an extension of his own skin, his signature gold pinky ring catching the flicker of 100 votive candles. To the public, he was the king of cool, the man with a drink in one hand and a joke in the other, the effortless crooner who seemed to glide through life without ever breaking a sweat. But today, the tan on his face looked like a mask of copper over ash. His eyes, usually dancing with a mischievous, heavy-lidded spark, were fixed on the polished mahogany of the casket resting at the altar. The man in the box was Artie, the mouse Moretti. He hadn't been a movie star or a chart-topping singer. He had been a piano player, a guy who had played the backrooms of Steubenville and the smoke-filled lounges of Sands for 30 years. Artie was a man who knew every one of Dean's keys, every breath he took between phrases, every hidden cue that signaled a joke was coming. He was a keeper of secrets, the man who had stayed sober so Dean could pretend not to be, and the friend who had never asked for a dime more than his union scale. His death had been sudden, a heart that simply gave out in the middle of a rehearsal, and the shock of it had cracked the porcelain veneer of Dean's carefully constructed public persona. The funeral was a strange collision of two worlds. On the right side of the aisle sat the Hollywood elite and the Vegas royalty, men in silk ties and women in furs, people who knew how to cry for the cameras. On the left sat the people from the old neighborhood, the cousins from Ohio, the stagehands, and the waiters who Artie had tipped too much. Between them stood the priest, a stern-faced man who spoke of dust and ashes in a voice that echoed against the stained glass. Dean felt a pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold air. It was a physical weight, a tightening of the lungs that made every breath feel like a chore. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. He had spent the time making calls, quietly paying off Artie's mortgage, setting up a trust for Artie's widowed sister, and ensuring that the mouse was buried with the kind of dignity a king would envy. He had done it all with a glass of apple juice in his hand, letting people believe it was scotch, because the act was easier than the reality. As the choir began a haunting rendition of Ave Maria, the music hit Dean like a physical blow. It took him back to the Sundays of his youth, to the Italian-American enclave, where Dino Crocetti was just a boy with a voice and a dream. He remembered his mother's rosary beads clicking like small teeth in the silence of their home. Religion for Dean wasn't something you talk about at cocktail parties. It was a foundational architecture, something built into the bones. He felt the sweat beginning to bead at his hairline. His heart, usually a steady, rhythmic metronome, was now a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He tried to focus on the flickering candles, on the smell of the lilies, on anything but the void that Artie's absence had left. The time came for the eulogy. The priest nodded toward Dean. The crowd shifted, a collective rustle of silk and wool, as everyone leaned forward. They expected a performance. They expected the Dean Martin who would lean against the pulpit, make a crack about the priest's wine, and tell a story that would make them laugh through their tears. Dean stood up, his legs feeling strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else. He stepped out into the aisle, and for a moment, the world tilted. The red carpet of the aisle seemed to stretch toward infinity, the faces of the mourners blurring into a sea of pale ghosts. He made it to the steps of the altar, his hand gripping the marble rail, so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked down at Artie's casket. The mahogany was so polished he could see his own reflection, distorted and tired. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the lines he had rehearsed, but the air wouldn't come. The tightness in his chest exploded into a searing heat. It wasn't just grief. It was a cumulative exhaustion of decades of being on, the weight of a secret heroism that no one saw, and the sudden, terrifying realization of mortality. To the horror of the assembly, the king of cool didn't just stumble, he buckled. His knees hit the stone floor with a sickening thud, and then he collapsed entirely, sliding down against the side of the casket. A collective gasp ripped through the cathedral. Frank Sinatra, sitting 3 rows back, was the first to move, his face a mask of sudden, panicked age. Sammy Davis Jr. stood up, his hands outstretched. The ushers ran forward, and the priest stepped down from the dais, his robes billowing. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of a woman sobbing in the back. For several long seconds, Dean lay there, his cheek pressed against the cold of Artie's final resting place. The cameras of the press, waiting outside, would have given anything for this shot. But inside, there was only a profound, reverent terror. Frank reached him first, grabbing Dean's shoulder. "Dino? Dino! Talk to me, pal," Frank whispered, his voice cracking. The priest leaned over, prepared to offer a blessing or a prayer for the dying. The crowd in the front pews craned their necks, the air thick with the scent of fear. They thought it was the end. They thought the lights were finally going down on the greatest showman of the era. But as the priest put his ear to Dean's lips, Dean's hand, the one with the gold ring, reached up and gripped the priest's vestments. Dean's eyes opened, but they weren't focused on the room. They were looking through the veil. He leaned in, his breath ragged, and whispered something into the priest's ear. The priest froze. His eyes widened, and he looked from Dean to the casket, then back to Dean again. It wasn't a request for a doctor. It wasn't a confession of a secret sin. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to drain the color from the priest's face. Slowly, with the help of Frank and an usher, Dean was hoisted back to his feet. He looked fragile, like a piece of expensive crystal that had been dropped and glued back together. He refused a chair. He refused the water they offered. He stood there, leaning heavily on the casket, and finally turned to the crowd. His voice, when it came, wasn't the smooth baritone the world knew. It was a gravelly, raw sound, stripped of all artifice. "He told me," Dean said, his voice echoing to the rafters. "Artie told me before he went that he wasn't afraid. He said he was just moving to a bigger room with a better piano." He paused, a ghost of a smile flitting across his tired face. "But that's not why I fell. I fell because I saw him. Just now. He was standing right there, by the candles, and he told me to tell you something." The crowd was frozen. In 1974, people didn't talk about visions in St. Patrick's. They talked about politics and movies. But the conviction in Dean's voice was undeniable. He wasn't acting. The man who had spent his life pretending to be a drunk was now being more soberly honest than anyone had ever seen him. "He told me to tell you," Dean continued, his voice gaining strength, "that the music doesn't stop. We think it does because we can't hear the frequency anymore, but it keeps going. He told me to tell his sister, Maria, that the rosary she lost in 1954 is in the velvet lining of the old piano bench in Steubenville. He said he wanted her to have it back, so she could pray for the rest of us, because we're the ones who are lost, not him." A sob broke out from the left side of the church. Artie's sister, a small woman in a black veil, collapsed into her seat, clutching her heart. The crowd was in a state of absolute shock. There was no way Dean could have known about a lost rosary from 20 years ago. There was no way he could have known the specific details of a family secret held 3 states away. The skeptics in the room, the agents, the lawyers, the cynical reporters, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sleet outside. Dean turned back to the priest. The whisper that had left the priest in shock wasn't just about the rosary. He had whispered, "He's forgiven, Father. I saw the light behind him, and it's gold. Tell him the debt is paid." For years, Artie had carried a secret burden of guilt over a mistake from his youth, a car accident that had changed a life. He had spent his existence in the shadow of that guilt, playing the piano as a form of penance. Dean, his closest friend, had known only fragments of it. But in that moment of collapse, in that thin space between the physical and the spiritual, Dean had seen the resolution. He had seen the heroic soul of a man who thought he was a failure. Dean didn't finish the eulogy with a joke. He didn't sing a note. He simply leaned over, kissed the top of the mahogany casket, and whispered, "Save a seat for me at the bar, pal, but make sure the piano's in tune." As he walked back to his seat, he didn't look like the king of cool anymore. He looked like Dino Crocetti, a man of faith, a man of profound loyalty, and a man who had just touched the hem of something eternal. The service concluded in a daze. When the pallbearers lifted the casket, Dean took his place at the front, his shoulder under the weight of the wood. He carried Artie out of the church and into the biting New York wind. The crowd followed, but they walked differently now. The divide between the Hollywood stars and the Ohio cousins had vanished. They were all just people standing in the rain, humbled by the mystery of what had just happened. Frank Sinatra walked beside Dean, his hand on Dean's arm, not to support him, but to be near the heat of whatever grace had just touched his friend. In the weeks that followed, the story of the collapse became a legend in the industry. The papers tried to claim it was exhaustion or a heart flutter or too much of the claret. But the people who were in the room knew better. They remembered the way the light seemed to change around the casket. They remembered the look in Dean's eyes. And Artie's sister did go back to Steubenville. She found the old piano bench, tucked away in a dusty basement. And when she ripped the frayed velvet lining, a set of blue glass beads fell into her hand. The rosary she had mourned for 2 decades. Dean Martin went back to his life, back to the shows and the records and the jokes. To the world, he remained the effortless icon of an era of glamour and cocktails. But for those who saw him at St. Patrick's, the mask had been pulled back forever. They saw a hero who didn't wear a cape, but a tailored suit, a man who protected his friends in life and served as their witness in death. He had shown them that even in the cynical heart of the 20th century, there was room for the miraculous. He had whispered a truth that left the crowd in shock, because it was a truth they had forgotten, that we are never truly alone, and that the greatest act of heroism is simply to love someone enough to see them into the light. The music, as Artie had said, never really stops. It just waits for us to find the right key. And Dean, the man who knew every note, had finally found the one that mattered most. He spent the rest of his years with a newfound quietude, a man who had seen the bigger room and was no longer afraid of the dark. Whenever he stepped onto a stage after that, before the first note of the orchestra, he would look up at the rafters, get a small private wink, and then, only then, would he begin to sing. The sleet turned to snow as the motorcade left the cathedral that day, covering the city in a blanket of white, turning the grid of New York into something pure and silent. Dean sat in the back of his car, watching the flakes melt against the glass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden crucifix Artie had given him years ago as a joke, a good luck charm for a gambler. Artie had called it. Dean held it tight in his palm until the wood grew warm. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in a long time, he didn't need a drink to feel at peace. He just needed the silence, the memory of the light, and the knowledge that his friend was finally home, playing a golden piano in a room where the sun never set. The world would remember Dean Martin for many things: the voice, the walk, the movies, the Rat Pack. But in the quiet corners of the Italian-American parishes and the late-night bars where the old-timers gathered, they told a different story. They told the story of the day the coolest man on earth fell to his knees and rose as a witness to the divine. They told the story of the whisper that shook a cathedral. And they remembered that beneath the tuxedo and the tan, there was a man who knew that the most beautiful song ever written wasn't "Everybody loves somebody sometime," but the silent prayer of friend for friend. As the years rolled on, that moment at the funeral became a touchstone for those who were there. It changed the way they treated one another. It softened the edges of the tough guys and brought a sense of perspective to the stars. It was a reminder that the cultural machinery of fame was just a temporary stage, and that the real drama was the one taking place in the heart. Dean Martin, the protagonist of his own epic journey, had navigated the heights of worldly success only to find his greatest victory in a moment of utter vulnerability. He had collapsed a star and stood up a man. He had whispered into the ear of the world, and though the world couldn't always hear him, the echo of that whisper remained. It was an echo of hope, of redemption, and of the enduring power of faith. It was a heroic legacy of Dino Crocetti, the boy from Steubenville who became a king, and the king who remembered how to be a boy in the presence of the eternal. The sleet had stopped, the city was white, and somewhere in a room with a better piano, the music was just beginning.